Vehicle Code 260 states in Section A commercial vehicle is a motor vehicle of a type required to be registered under this code, used or maintained for the transportation of persons for hire, compensation, or profit, or designed, used, or maintained primarily for the transportation of property. Section B of that code, 260 again, passenger vehicles and house cars that are not used for the transportation of persons for hire, compensation, or profit are not commercial vehicles. I first read the vehicle code back in 2003 and realized that it really didn't apply to me, that it didn't include my property. And as such, I then sent out a series of letters to about 6 people, the Department of Motor Vehicles, the Commissioner of the Highway Patrol, the Attorney General, and a few other people, the Department of Transportation, the Governor of the state. And I very, quickly started to discover that I was right. I was correct. I did get a letter back from the Attorney General. And
you were correct in what?
In my assumption that I did not, it did not apply to me.
You did not need a driver's
I did
license.
not need a driver's license, and that I did not need registration for the cars or automobiles that I was using. So having gathered that, I then set about to cancel those documents, and I did that back around 2004 after a series of letters went back and forth.
Cancel which documents?
Driver's license and, driver's license and registration.
Cancel them by mail. You're giving written notice?
I gave written notice. It was actually a complete series. I would say I contracted out of the system.
Okay.
I did get those things notarized. I had everything sent by a notary ultimately. And the conclusion that the group of us came to, when I say the group of us, I mean the 6 individuals I wrote to who worked for the state and myself, came to the conclusion that it was not for me. And
having the licenses.
Having the license, yeah. I issued my own documents. I issued my own identity document. I issued my own certificate of absolute title or absolute ownership, not title. I issued my own bond for insurance purposes, or financial responsibility is really what it's called.
Now that sounds like a lot of work, a lot of study. Okay.
It was a lot of work.
Okay. And this enables you to utilize the public highways without the licenses, is the idea.
Absolutely. And I was perfectly safe for a couple of years. I traveled around the place, I didn't actually get stopped or anything. Nobody stopped me. I had my own plate made up, and everybody had been noticed, and it wasn't an issue. A couple of years into this, I did have an issue with an officer, and ultimately he arrested me, impounded my car, and at the time he discovered that my car was not in the system, that I was not in the system, and he could not understand it. He could not find any evidence of me existing. So I know that my process had an effect. It had actually wiped out any recognition of me within the system. And I had received a couple of small tickets previously.
But he should not have arrested you then.
No.
So how did that resolve?
Well, it wasn't actually too good. What happened was about 8-9 hours after I was arrested, they managed to locate old tickets, and which included the automobile I was driving, and technically they put me back into the system. Ultimately, this resulted in my having a bail of about $920,000 for driving without a license. I was $1 million baby.
How did it get that high?
Because, yeah, that's kind of another interesting story. Well, they couldn't hold me. Every time I was arrested, I would sign as the authorized representative and I would be released. So I was constantly cite and released, and I would never go into court because there was no consent. And we'll get into that in a second. The element of consent is the major element. Anyway, this went on for a number of years, and slowly the bail kept going up and up and up, because every time they got me, I would, have this way out.
So eventually the highest amount of bail
was $920,000. Yes, it
that.
worked up to that.
Okay.
Yes, and I can tell you, the officers were very excited whenever they found me. You would have thought I'd murdered a few people, but so what I really would like to explain today is the major elements that have enabled me to come to these conclusions. I started off with these conclusions, and I've pretty much proven that the conclusions are correct.
Okay, now before we go on,
Sure.
are you still under $900,000 threat? In other words, if people hear this and you owe $1 million and you are a fugitive from justice, then they will not want to follow your...
No, not at all. No, ultimately I ended up with $100 fine, and yeah, that's everything's been dealt with. Yes, I'm not a fugitive. Yes. I did make a mistake, but that's a whole nother issue. We have tested out these theories with other people as well. But anyway, so let me explain the main elements of what I discovered. The California Vehicle Code only applies, it's a private code, let me emphasize that, it's a private code, and it only applies to certain persons. It only applies to certain property within a certain location.
We think it applies to all of us, everything, everywhere. We're wrong.
It's a belief system. It's definitely a belief system, and I would say, many police may have that same belief system too.
Probably all.
Probably all of them.
They're enforcing.
They're specifically hired, or they're hired for their specific beliefs and attitude. They're not going to hire somebody that's timid or anything. So somebody who's a control freak, who really likes to assert themselves, and that's what they do. And they're told that they have this power and authority. For instance, they'll be told, you have power and authority throughout this state. I don't disagree with that statement. However, we need to look at what is this state. So
this state could be something different than what we all think it is.
It is. In this state is the terminology, but yes, and and I've spoken to California state patrol officers, let's call them, or state law enforcement officers, and they will tell you that their power extends everywhere within this state.
And they are flat wrong.
No, they're right.
Okay.
It does extend to everywhere within this state.
But we have to understand what this state
or
means.
what within this state means.
How is that defined?
Absolutely. Let's get to that. Let's first look at the person upon which the vehicle code applies. So I'm going to read a section of the vehicle code which tells you.
Very good.
So this comes from the California Vehicle Code section 21052. The provisions of this code applicable to the drivers of vehicles upon the highways apply to the drivers of all vehicles while engaged in the course of employment by this state, any political subdivision thereof, any municipal corporation, or any district, including authorized emergency vehicles subject to those exemptions granted such authorized emergency vehicles in this code.
So most people literally do not fall in those categories.
No, technically, the vehicle code is, like I say, a private code, and you have to kind of look at the history of the vehicle code. Originally, it was a place for us to keep information on our collective property. So the car that the sheriff is driving, the car that our other officers use, public officers, absolutely. It was not intended for our private property. Original jurisdiction for that was filed with the Secretary of State, and it was like $2 for the entire time that you would own your car. And we'll call it an automobile, which is really the proper terminology for it, not a motor vehicle, which is something totally different. So automobile would be everything, and motor vehicle is a very minute portion of that bigger pie.
Of those objects.
That property.
Yeah.
So that tells you the person that the vehicle code operates on.
Applies to.
Yeah, and so now you'll be wondering, well, how did I get into that? And we'll get to that in a moment on how you get roped in on this. The second thing we need to look at is the actual property, because you have to understand that the vehicle code is divided into two elements. We have the Department of Motor Vehicles, which is the first section of the code, and then we have the Highway Patrol, as we call it nowadays. That's the second part. The original name for the Highway Patrol is the Enforcement Division of the Department of Motor Vehicles. Just so you can understand that, that's its original intent. When you actually read the entire code, you'll see in that section what their main job is. Their main job is to report to Congress. Let's say we're riding down the highway and there's a bend, a really sharp bend, and everyone keeps going off the bend and there's multiple accidents occurring there. It's their job to find those places, let Congress know so that they can, create a bill to fix that problem. The other element of their job, which I always love this part, it kind of describes it to a T, where it says, an officer may use as many flares as he needs to without ever having to pay for them himself. His job is safety. Then that's paraphrased, but that's basically how I remember it. That's, the cute little way that the code is kind of written. So you have this department that is there to keep track of our collective property. And then you have this other element, which is the enforcement of keeping track of all that property. And so there was another part of this code that kind of always stayed in my mind. And I'm going to paraphrase it here because it's from one of the earlier parts of the code. But it basically says, if at the time of an accident, the officer is attending the accident because that's within the purview of his agency, basically. He's there for safety purposes. If at the time of an accident he discovers that a person is required to be licensed and is not licensed, if they're required to be registered, the car is required to be registered and it's not registered, then he's to issue a citation in triplicate and they are to appear at the Department of Motor Vehicles for a hearing.
The one that would have licensed.
Absolutely. The person who's being cited is actually appearing at the Department of Motor Vehicles.
Yes.
Now, when you look at the construction of the codes, what we're looking at is, the singular includes the plural includes the singular. So when you look at the word commissioner, you have a commissioner of the Highway Patrol, you have commissioners of the court. You're going before a hearing commissioner. So technically, at that time, you're in the Department of Motor Vehicles. When you read the code, it seems pretty clear that that's what's happening. It's an administrative hearing, and you are appearing at the Department of Motor Vehicles. You're appearing within the purview of that jurisdiction.
They call it traffic court.
They call it traffic court.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right.
And they link it to criminal to give it some kind of standing, but technically it's quasi-civil. But if they told you it was quasi-civil, you wouldn't go. So they trick you into thinking it's criminal. So they'll say criminal and traffic just to get you in there. So anyway, so that's the person. It's really to take care of state employees and operators of state property because they're required to protect the public. So when we look at the purview of the property that is being looked after, as I've mentioned, it is state-owned property. But if we look at the vehicle code, so I'm going to read this section right here, and this comes at 260. So besides the state property, this is the other element that is regulated. California Vehicle Code 260 states in Section A commercial vehicle is a motor vehicle of a type required to be registered under this code, used or maintained for the transportation of persons for hire, compensation, or profit, or designed, used, or maintained primarily for the transportation of property. Section B of that code, 260 again, passenger vehicles and house cars that are not used for the transportation of persons for hire, compensation, or profit are not commercial vehicles. So
this is publicly owned vehicles or vehicles that are involved in
commerce.
In commerce, making revenue from their usage.
Absolutely, which is in line with the federal statutes under Title 18, Section 36. There's a whole part in there in regards to, it defines used for commercial purposes and what that really means.
So again, this does not apply to most drivers of automobiles.
Absolutely not. No. Neither our property nor us, and I'm using these terms very loosely or in the ordinary language, not in legal language, because these things have other meanings, of course, when you hit legalese. So, if I say you and I really mean you and me, and you can't, you almost run out of words because of legalese, but yes.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. So most people are not in this jurisdiction.
Let's discuss this jurisdiction. So you have to understand that we have 29 codes in California. Those 29 codes are actually one statute.
So that's like government code, penal code, this code, that code.
Absolutely.
Under one statute.
Under one statute. So the definitions in one particular code apply throughout the codes, throughout all 29 codes, unless it's expressly stated within that code. So for instance, and it makes sense when you do that, because for instance, if you go to the Business and Professions Code, if I'm going to talk about contractors, when I say, if you come and get a contractor's license, then you're the person I'm now referring to in this part of the code. Persons include that person that's licensed under the...
They redefine the word person.
Absolutely, yes. These things have to be defined. So, it's not applying to me because I didn't go and apply for that driver's or that license. Right. So it's very important that we have that clear. Now, when we look at the state forum, there's a couple of things you really have to look at. You have to look at the fact that California is a federal corporation under the Buck Act. All the states are considered federal corporations. State of whatever state is a federal corporation. So one of the things that you need to look at is the taxing forum, which is where all of the codes gain their location. That's where they're all located at. This is where all the laws actually apply, unless they say otherwise. So when you look for forum, we need to look at the Revenue and Taxation Code. It comes up numerous times, but in terms of property, we can look at 130F, and this is what it describes as being the forum. 130F, the term in this state, very important, it's in quotes, it comes up a lot in all the various codes. Whenever they use the term in this state or within this state, it's referring to this location.
So we'll find out now what in this state means.
In this state means within the exterior limits of the state of California and includes all territory within these limits owned by or ceded to the United States of America.
So it's not what we think it is, the boundaries of the state that you see on a map. It is those portions of the state that are owned or ceded to the federal government.
Sure.
So what we think is a state jurisdiction of traffic control or enforcement is actually a federal jurisdiction. So we're all misled on that.
Yes, there is, it's not so much misled. Okay, so if you imagine at the construction of the Constitution, there's two elements in there. There's one, the formation of the government for the people, but for and by the people. And then there's the formation of the administration of the government. Okay. Two different entities. Yeah. And what we keep falling into is that portion that was actually created for the administration of the government, the rules for the smooth running of the government. That's what we keep falling into. So we keep becoming state employees, operators of state property, or government employees. The office of person is really an important element for people to kind of understand. Yes. So there is the government as such, which really doesn't exist, and we won't get into that right now, but technically there is a government, and then there is a government for governing the government. Right. And that's the issue right there. That's really the one that's come to the forefront, and that's where we keep kind of falling down that rabbit hole, because we keep falling in as a member of the government and applicable to the rules that govern the running of the government.
It seems some sort of fraud has pulled us into a place where we don't belong.
I really stay away from the word fraud, mostly because I do prefer belief system. It's a belief system. We think that we think and we've been trained to look up to this as an authority. It's not true. They've been trained to treat us with authority, and they think that that's so. It's a lot of beliefs going on.
A belief system
Yes.
could be true.
Yes.
This one is not.
It's not true. Yes,
Okay.
it's not true.
So where do we go from here?
Well, let me explain the other part, because this is the important thing is, by now you'll be wondering, well, how did I get into this? How did I, it is part of the belief system. You believed that you were required to have a license. So you walked into the Department of Motor Vehicles and you went and applied for a license or registration for your car or your automobile, even though you was not using it in the method that is regulated. It's not you was not participating in a regulated activity, and you was not the regulated person, but you volunteered into that system.
You were not offering your vehicle for hire.
Yes, but you thought you needed one, so you walked in and got one. And then here's the thing, the guy at the DMV only has one type of license. I mean, they do have motorcycles or whatever, but there's only one system that they have of their own kind of governance. And you filled out an application as it was. The way that you filled it out showed that you were qualified to do that. You took a test. So there's a lot of intent going on here.
So you represented yourself
as being
within their jurisdiction.
Absolutely, yes.
But you did that. They didn't do it.
They didn't do it to you.
You went in by applying for the license. You did that yourself.
Yeah, and we can go into that just in a little bit of how we keep falling into that kind of trap. So first of all, I want to show you where the license comes in and where the property first gets registered. So those can be found in California Vehicle Code 17459 and 17460. 17459 says the acceptance by a resident of this state of a certificate of ownership or a certificate of registration of any motor vehicle or any renewal thereof issued under the provisions of this code shall constitute the consent by the person that service of summons may be made upon him within or without this state, whether or not he is then a resident of this state, in any action brought in the courts of this state upon a cause of action arising in this state out of the ownership or operation of a motor vehicle. So it's a very interesting construction of language right there. We begin as a resident of this state.
And this is the state you defined a minute ago.
Yes.
Which is not really a real state. It's sort of a ceded areas to the federal government.
Yes, and just to, very limited, this is not, really relevant in the sense, but it's important to understand back in the 1860s, actually the land was ceded away from the United States of America. Any of you that have got land patents and looked at those, the land was actually ceded away, and now they're talking about land that's been ceded to. So the chances are you're not on land that was ceded to the United States, and you can probably show that you're actually on land that was ceded from the United States,
right,
or sold by them.
Right.
So the other section, CVC 17460, is very similar in nature. The acceptance or retention by a resident of this state of a driver's license issued pursuant to the provisions of this code shall constitute the consent of the person that service of summons may be made on him within or without this state, whether or not he is then a resident of this state, in any action brought in the courts of this state upon a cause of action arising in this state out of his operation of a motor vehicle anywhere within this state.
So only by applying for the license are
Yes.
you becoming
Consenting.
subject to that.
Yes. So acceptance implies there's a choice. Consent implies you've now consented to be the agent for the service of process. So you will be brought into the courts.
And why does the state need my consent to enforce upon me?
It is a civil action. They are required to have your consent in the first place. You have to agree to go into the courts. And even that, none of these things are in concrete, should we say. You can still escape but it just makes it more harder. If you have a driver's license, you've already consented at service of summons. Now you need to go into court. It will go to a warrant. There's other fail-safes that they have to really drag you along into the system. If you don't have these two contracts to begin with,
the license and the registration.
The license and the registration, there's really not very much that they can do. They can issue a fine. That's if they even issue a ticket. Generally, without the consent, there's nowhere that they can go.
They can't issue a warrant.
They can't issue a warrant. So we've looked at this. We've looked at two particular elements. Like, for instance, for most of us that are now old discovering this, and you decide that you're ready to get rid of these contracts, we have other things to overcome. There's a lot of presumptions and assumptions out there. So if you're caught traveling around in your car without a driver's license, it will be the assumption that you forgot to renew it. So that's one element you need to overcome. If you are young enough and you've never had a license right now, this is really important for you guys, because if you've never had one, and let's say you actually get stopped, what will happen is they will issue a ticket and you will get this weird number in the place of where it says driver's license. Now you don't have one. But what happens is the DMV has a little office that is a presumptive office. It's sitting there waiting for you to get a license. And so they issue it's called the issuance department. They're issuing you with a number just in case you decide to go get a license.
Now, how do they know you exist?
Because you just gave them your name.
At the traffic stop.
At the traffic stop, you give them your name. The officer will issue a ticket. The ticket will have a bogus number on it, or a number that you don't recognize. It's not really bogus to them. We have done some research on this, and it comes from the DMV's issuance department, and they're sitting there waiting for the application. Now, so far, it's not a problem. There probably won't be a court case. We have not seen court cases happen at this time. So you'll have a date to appear, but when you actually look, you'll find out you've never consented. The best thing you can do with that right there is to send it back and say, I don't consent. That's one way of handling it. What we found is later on, if you go get a license, if you apply for a license, any tickets that were created with the issuance of that, it's not even temporary, but it's pending license.
The number they made up.
The number they've made up. If they can link you at that address of that age and all those things to now your application,
you're now culpable to all
those past
prior. Yeah.
Yes. So it's very ingenious, the little system they have set up. And this is definitely, it applies only to California. Other states don't have these same things. If you don't register your car, it's assumed that you no longer want registration. In California, of course, it's assumed that you forgot to renew it, that somehow, you're incompetent and something. Life happened and you forgot. So, there's all kinds of past dues, fees, and whatever not that they'll try and wrap on you. But yeah, in other states that doesn't apply. I think it's a nice little point for me to mention right now. California has a renewal every 4 years of a driver's license. They're at risk of losing jurisdiction every 4 years, except under these presumptions of law that they create, that is only for California. Other states don't do this. In England, which is where I'm from, the license is issued for life. It's good to your 75th birthday, because England did not want to risk losing jurisdiction. Rather than be in commerce, because that's the other thing, California has chosen that it wants the revenue generated every 4 years, which is quite substantial, and risk losing jurisdiction. England would rather, maintain jurisdiction at the risk of losing a couple of bucks.
And tax you some other way.
Absolutely. TV licenses. Absolutely. But that goes to show you the law is uniform everywhere. The theory, I'm telling you, is absolutely uniform. Another one that you can check up is a case called O'Neill. In the O'Neill case, it's called O'Neill versus the Department of Professional and Vocational Standards. It's from June 5th, 1935, and it was heard in the Second Appellate District. And just real briefly, What that says is, you know, O'Neill was a guy that had a contractor's license at some point. He got pulled up before the board for some violations. They fined him, even though his license was expired and he had not asked to have it renewed. Ultimately, he goes to court. The court rules against him. He goes to the appellate division, and the appellate division rules. The judgment of the Superior Court is reversed with direction that it adjudge and decree that the order made by the Registrar of Contractors be declared null and void for lack of jurisdiction.
And what about that he was engaging in construction activity without a license?
That doesn't, you know, that becomes a personal contract issue. If I hire you to do a job for me and you don't do it, then I can take you into court. But if you're unlicensed, that's my only remedy. If you're licensed, I then have to go through the board, and what happens is you have an administrative hearing, they find you guilty of something, they fine you, you pay the board, and I get nothing.
Yeah, so if he's not licensed, the only issue is he has to tell you he's not licensed, or not tell you
Absolutely.
that he is licensed.
Yes.
Otherwise, there's no complaint on the part of the government.
Yes.
Because you're just
You're not-
engaging in rightful activity.
Absolutely. Yes, exactly. You're using your labor in exchange for something, you know, just and fair.
Value.
A value, yes.
Okay. So how do we get out of our ticket? In other words, we've talked about not having a license.
Sure.
And as actually having an advantage legally by not having a license.
Yes.
This is a very difficult, concept for many
Yes.
people. So wherever we are in the explanation, let's move forward so people can really get a grasp of how this may come around to their lives.
Yeah, okay, so, I've gone through quite a few traffic stops and a lot of issues, and with court, this is by far the easiest way of dealing with it, is by not having those contracts to begin with. Once you step into their arena, you're pretty much fodder for their, there are ways out, but you're going to have to, use legal arguments to maneuver your way out. My favorite one is always the verified complaint, and I know a lot of people have problems with the verified complaint.
Requiring the court show a verified complaint in order to enforce against you.
Absolutely. I think one of the important things people have to understand with the court can appear to move forward with its processes. They can send you to the public defender's office. They can, hurl you through the court and keep going and keep going and keep going and bring you back there. And what you have to do is you have to stand on your rights. Because what happens is they can appear to proceed, but they cannot effect judgment. And
so you think they're actually about to put you in jail, or about to fine you a huge amount,
Yeah.
or about to do this? They're threatening it. They've got everything
it's
against
called
you.
going through the motions.
Yeah, but actually, unless they have the verified complaint, and unless you are demanding to see it,
Yes.
then
If you haven't waived your right.
they can't quite finish off. Is that the idea?
Yes, and you have to know the local rules of where you are. So it's very hard for me to tell you this is what you need to do, but you need to know the local rules. Some of the local rules, for instance, San Bernardino has it that you had to stipulate for a commissioner or a hearing officer to hear the case. In Riverside, for instance, it's assumed you agree to that unless you object. So you really need to know those rules.
And let's explain the verified complaint. This
Sure.
is a sworn statement
Yes.
by someone who says
They're injured.
that you've injured them.
Yes.
And that's something you never have, or
Yes.
very rarely have, in a traffic case of any kind.
Yeah, you need to have a controversy as such, or a controversy, if you guys would like to hear it that way. I learned a few things along the way, and one of those is a controversy. So here's a little scenario for you. Somebody calls the police on you. Domestic dispute is a very common thing. Someone calls the police, and the police come out. And they say to you, hey, what's going on? And immediately you start running your mouth. This person's done this person's done that. Great, they now have an argument ensuing. If you turn around and say, well, do you have a complaint? It will stop them in their tracks. So you can see that without a complaint that needs to be verified by the other party, the police cannot proceed.
And the police officer may think that by witnessing you rolling through the stop sign, that he has a complaint.
He has a complaint. He doesn't.
But he doesn't because
No.
he's not injured.
He's not injured. And not only that, he can't be the witness, the police officer, and all the parties to it. I mean, you hear that a lot. He can't be everything. Some people will ask the commissioner, for instance, what's the nature and cause of the action? That's a really good question to kind of get that down. And but I think we should kind of discuss that maybe in a different.
Another time.
Yeah, because it's pretty long. It's really important to understand the nature and cause of an action. Yeah, and you need to go into that pretty clearly.
Okay, so now most people do have a license at this stage in history, and so there's a process of noticing that you are giving the license back, you are giving it up.
Absolutely.
Abdicating, and is that where we're going now with this?
Yeah, let's go there. So if you are ready to get rid of your license and to remove your cars from registration, there is a process. There is a DMV form called DL142, and you can fill that out. And it does ask for a reason why you're giving it up. And if, it has to be very personal to you. If you've done your research, you can put fraud if you want. I was under the impression I needed one, and I've read the code, and now I don't. I understand I don't need one. It really is a personal reason as to why you're giving it up. So you would write that in there, and you can just literally send back your license. The important thing, real key here, is to make sure you get something back from them. That form is a two-part form. You could walk in there and get a stamped, filed copy. That's one way. There is also a letter that they give out which kind of thanks you for the consideration of you canceling your driving privilege. That's a really good letter to have, because otherwise what happens is the police pull you over, they come under the presumption that you forgot to renew it, especially if they find you in the system and they find an old driver's license number there. They're going to assume that you forgot. So it's very important for you to be able to show that, rebut that presumption immediately. And I've been in stops where that's happened, and it really is, you see the little light go on and they're like, oh. So, and I've been in stops where they don't have that notice, and they really will go on that presumption. Oh no, you just forgot to renew it. Oh no, I canceled it.
So would it be wise to do the return of the license and the paperwork at the counter, where you can get a signature and you can insist on some sort of receipt or paperwork acknowledging that action?
Absolutely, yes.
So it's maybe better not to do it by mail. You just may never get anything back.
You might not get anything back. Absolutely. You can do it at the counter.
And you have to be assertive to say, I need a record of this.
I need a record of this. Another thing that you can do for anyone that's already canceled their driver's license and they're experiencing the problem that I'm highlighting right here, which is that during a stop, they're just assuming that you still are driving and you've forgotten to renew your license. You can, if you have any proof that you did cancel the driver's license, that you did DL142, or that you did some sort of mailing, because in my case, I actually did a series, a process, so I have proof, then walk into your nearest DMV office with that proof and show it to them and ask them for a copy of the notice of cancellation. It's very important that you carry that letter with you. Now, in regards to...
No, that could be a photocopy. You just keep many copies.
Oh, yeah.
But it is the record.
It is the record. It's proof right there. And it really does rebut that presumption for them. Now, in terms of the car being removed from registration, that has had some other difficulties. I did achieve that, like I said before, and an officer did put it back. You could just do like I did in that case, which was to send out a series of letters to a number of people requesting that they remove it. I did get it removed, so it's definitely possible to do that. There are other ways to do it too, and that is through a foreign trust is another way. I'm trying to think of any other ways there are. I know people have come up with some ways, for instance, like junking the car. I really don't recommend the junking the car, but it is possible to do it that way as well.
When you say a foreign trust, you're trying to make some official paperwork that claims the authority over the vehicle. Is that correct?
Well, what happens is you just literally, in the same way that you would transfer a car from me to you, I would just transfer the car from me to my foreign trust. And what I've done is you include the EIN on that transfer so that they can then look it up and realize that it is foreign.
Now, anyone can create a foreign trust.
Anyone
correct?
can create a foreign trust, yes.
Right.
But there is an EIN that you do get from the IRS, which is a 98 number. So anybody that has that 98 number, there are a lot of us out there, you can move the car directly into that vehicle. And what I did is I then wrote an email to the Department of Transportation, and I said to them, hey, you know, I have use of an automobile that is owned by a foreign trust that is recognized by the United States of America. What do I do with my tags? And the response was, return them immediately to the nearest DMV.
Okay,
So
now
yeah.
you're driving without tags now.
Well, and then what I did is I took that email and I keep it in my car. Yes, and that's without, yes, because if you're actually traveling with a car that is owned by a foreign entity and you have California plates on it, that's considered a misdemeanor. I've forgotten the section that that's at, but it actually comes up as being a misdemeanor.
No license plate.
Well, no, not no license plate. If you have a California plate and the car is not owned in California.
Oh, okay. So you have to remove the plate.
You have to remove the plate, yes. So once I was aware of that, it comes under the foreign organizations section. You'll see in there that it's actually listed as a misdemeanor. So you really do need to remove the plate. But for the purposes of being safe, which is what this is all about, the idea is to be able to travel safely. And if you've just got no plate, you're running a risk. So I did send the email and I got the response, and I carry the email in that automobile.
You're talking about being safe from getting pulled over.
Oh yeah,
for
and
the
having the
violation,
car, yes.
And
Yes.
So you will get pulled over. What about the
Maybe,
idea? What
maybe.
about the idea of a license plate that says Foreign Trust 99528?
I actually have my EIN on mine. I created my own plate and I use that one, and I've had it like that for maybe 5 years now, no problem.
As long as it doesn't look like a California plate.
As long as it's not looking, yeah, like a fraud in their system. So yes, you can do that. You can even, you know, I used to use my own plates quite a lot, especially when I'd removed everything from the system with my own emblem on there, my own heraldry, crest. That was cool. Yeah, so there's various things. And, you know, people have managed to maneuver this pretty well. So, yeah, it is possible to do.
Okay. So what do we not know yet about getting sort of outside the system and getting pirated by the government bureaucrats and the black and white police cars?
There is one other safety measure that you can do. If if you're venturing down this road, there's nothing worse than having your car impounded and ending up with all these court cases. It really is frustrating and depressing. So one of the if you can learn from my education, it's great. I'm really happy for you. Yes,
Thank
absolutely.
You. We'll try. That's the idea.
Yes. So there is a final safety. So back in 2004 or so, like I say, I'd read the vehicle code, and I did get an impound. I think it was 2000, might have been 2005 or 2006. But anyway, somewhere way back when, after I'd done all this, in fact, it's during the same cop was having this problem with me. So I want to make that clear that a series of events occurred about a year and a half, 2 years after I'd done this. So it must have been around 2005, 2006.
An officer kind of got a vendetta going.
Yes. Yeah. I embarrassed him in front of his rookies, and he, he's
will never live that down.
Yeah. Yes. And so the next day was the very first day I was ever impounded as a result of this.
Right.
So, yes. So what happened after that very first time I was impounded? I was already aware under California Vehicle Code Section 4021, a repossessor may, repossess a car without the need of registration and stuff. So I went and repossessed my car with a security agreement. And
you went to the impound?
the impound yard, yes.
Where do you get a security agreement to repossess your car?
Well, I hate to get into the straw man thing, and so there's a lot more to this. But yes, between myself and me, myself, and Irene, we did have a security agreement. I'd actually had one for quite some time, so it was already created, and the car was already within that security agreement. At this point, I'm going to mention, because this kind of sounds flighty to people, but when you look at many banks have leasing companies. They have leasing companies, and they lease their desk, their operations, everything that they use from a leasing company that they happen to own. It's the same thing. So I have a very similar structure that's set up.
Right. So you securitize
I've
the car
securitized,
with
yes.
yourself or an entity
Absolutely.
that you control.
Yes.
And so you have studied a little law, and you understand trust a little bit.
A little bit to do that, and the way that you have liens and all the rest of it. And when you look at the vehicle code, the vehicle code actually mentions the Uniform Commercial Code, which is kind of interesting. If you think it's a state law, but it mentions the Uniform Commercial Code, it's over 300 odd times, 350 odd times, and in each of those places, it mentions that the UCC is superior in nature to the vehicle code. So just so that you kind of get an idea of that. So
what is in the UCC that we need?
Yes, there are a couple of sections within there. Certainly the idea of liens is within there. Well, there's really only a possessory lien that exists in the vehicle code, but the idea of a security agreement and all those things would be in the Uniform Commercial Code. So So I created a security agreement, and I went to go pick up my car, and I said, I'm here to repossess the car, and so the woman says to me, do you have a repossession order? And I hold on, and I'm like, a what? She goes, a repossession order and a hold harmless. And I go, oh, I've forgotten that. Hold on a minute, I'll be right back. So I ran home, looked them up, got one, went back, repossessed my car.
When you say got one, you wrote it up.
Yeah, I wrote it up.
Maybe get a notary on it or something.
Oh, I didn't need a notary. The great thing about this is when you actually read the code, there is no requirements for a secured party to have anything notarized. And you can have copies. You don't need the originals. And yeah, we repossessed my car, so.
And did you pay the impound fees?
You have to pay the impound fees. That's a private deal. But you could go after the officer later on. I didn't at that time, but that's where your remedy would lie, would be really with the officer. Although many people take the impound yard to court. I'm not sure if I've heard of any successes. I would be interested to hear of any successes. And I'm of the mindset that I want my car quickly.
So you came up with a way where you were supposed to come in with a court and police approved
no police approval necessary.
Release of your vehicle.
Yeah. And
you found another form of security trust that is just as valid to the impound lot.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I found a way that I could repossess my, and I'm calling it my very loosely there because it's technically the way that it was owned. Actually, I had the certificate of absolute ownership, so it really was mine at that time.
So the impound lot was holding your car for the police, actually.
Yes.
And the police were hoping and expecting for some
registration
revenue from you, which you denied them by coming up with a legal way to bypass that.
Yes, and you do bypass the police department. Usually what happens is you have to go to the police department and you get a release. Right. In this instance, I was not required to get a release. And it's a really nice little system to have set up. I would be, within groups, we should have these things set up. And even in the case that, if I was arrested and my car was impounded, somebody else from the group could actually go pick it up. Right. So I think, I think it's really important. We're always coming from behind. Right. They're always grabbing our stuff and we're having to, get it back. And this is a way of kind of securing it and having that extra protection. So,
and as you say, it's good to network and develop
groups,
and you've been very active with groups as well.
Yes.
And so that's something everyone should look at is who else will understand this, who else might help me and cooperate in this, and who else could I trade favors with so that we could present a united front against this kind of revenue schemes that are being worked on us.
Exactly, exactly. Ideally, you won't have this problem. If you don't have a driver's license, you don't have the registration contract, the acceptance and consent, if you don't have those two elements, you shouldn't really have the problem. However, we know that there are officers out there that don't, you piss them off, something happens, and they're in that belief system. They're going to impound your car. It's nice to have something set up as a backup, and this is a kind of nice way of doing that. So.
And would you say that when police act, it sounds like they're really committing a crime? I mean, they're seizing property, they're putting you through nuisance, they're violating your liberties, and they're doing so criminally. And when we say based on a belief system, that's not the law. That's a belief system. They don't have the law on their side. They think they do, and they don't. Is that correct?
Well, yes and no. If we have contracted in, then they generally do. If we have not contracted in, they really don't. They do not have that right. This is quasi-civil. It is not criminal in nature. The Supreme Court has recently ruled on the civil forfeitures, and they're really erring on our side right now. This all started, I think it was around 95 when the Safe Streets Act came out with Clinton. I was first impounded very shortly after, and back then they didn't even have proper forms to give you. So, I've complained, worked the system, worked things out quite a lot. I think I was probably one of the first ones, and it was because of, my complaints and stuff that then they started to have, proper citations that were in line with the law. They did. I didn't get it compensated, but they did correct their failures. Yeah, absolutely. So, and I'd find a new part every time that it happened to me. Every time I was impounded, and I have been impounded quite a number of times. I've taken quite a lot of beatings, and yes, and I feel comfortable that where I'm at right now is actually a really good place, and I'm happy to share this with others.
I think what I may call this video is the bravest woman in the world. You are quite the fighter.
It is quite funny, but yes. So I have been through quite a lot on this, and learned to maneuver that through pretty well. So
yes. Well, that was some fabulous information.
Thank you.
I'm sure people could watch that once or twice or three times and start to absorb that, because there are some things you mentioned where you do have to go down a little bit of legal study on, and you have to understand. Any final comment on how people might proceed who, may not know the steps to take?
Sure. Make sure that you understand who you are, the property that you have, and the location where you are. It's really important to understand the terminology that's being used against you.
Yeah, so when you say where you are,
yes,
how the law defines where you are.
Absolutely.
What that means in a technical sense, because we all think we know where we are, but what matters in this case is the law.
Sure.
And what you found was that it means something very different from what you think it means.
It does mean something totally different, yeah. And you really need to understand that venue that they're presuming is that you're on land that's been ceded to the United States, and you are using a zip code. That's why many of us don't use zip codes and the federal definitions and federal places. Yeah, exactly. And here's the thing: when you look at, like, there was some confusion as to whether it is a state or federal issue. When you look at police cars, what does it say? It says CA exempt. CA car is a federal designation.
Meaning California.
It doesn't necessarily mean California. California is the actual geographical location. State of California is the federal corporation. And so, and car is a layer within that whole section, right? CA is the federal.
All its own.
Absolutely. That's the federal designation for the state of California.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So are we good for now?
I'm good.
Thank you so much,
You're welcome.
Jackie Fig.